dan Pak Iwan. I would like to start the discussion.
Sure.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Okay. Good afternoon and good morning, Monsieur Manguin. Before starting this discussion, I would like to introduce myself. My name is IFI Afam. You can call me IFI or Fai. I'm the moderator of this discussion. I was graduated from a master in a political science program, the University of Paris 8, Vincent Saint-Denis in France. I'm now a junior lecturer of Universitas Airlangga in the Department of Political Science, precisely. And we have our special guest in Indonesian language. We use tamu agung. Tamu agung kita, Monsieur Pierre-Yves Manguin, who is currently the Emeritus Director of Studies of Pre-Modern History and Archaeology of Southeast Asia, École Française d'Extrême Orient of France. How are you today, Mr. Manguin?
Oh, fine, thank you.
Yeah,
it's cold in Paris still.
Yeah,
we are in winter, but it's all right.
If I'm not mistaken, it's already in spring, right?
Not quite. Not quite.
Not quite. Yeah.
No, it's
almost
rainy and gray today.
Yeah.
Only 5 degrees.
Yeah. And the next, I would like to continue with our second speaker, Bapak Iwan Sumantri from the Departemen Arkeologi of the Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Hasanuddin Makassar. Good afternoon, Pak Iwan. Bagaimana kabarnya?
Kabar baik.
Yeah. Do you have class today in Makassar?
Yes, actually I have a class, but harus libur karena dengan Pak Manguin ini.
I see. Ini tamu agung kita, our special
guest.
Yeah.
Sangat terhormat saya sangat terhormat.
Yeah. Okay. Today we will discuss our interesting topics to help us understand more about the foundation of political entities in Southeast Asia, especially on the maritime civilization entitled Early States and the Rise of a Nation in Southeast Asia. Okay, everyone, to open this discussion, Bapak Iwan Sumantri will give us a brief introduction to our discussion. Excuse me, Pak Iwan, you will have around 15 minutes. Terima kasih. Thank you very much.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih, Pak Moderator. Pak Manguin yang sering di Indonesia akan menjadi Manguin, padahal itu salah ucap. Saya sendiri tidak bisa berbahasa Prancis, juga berbahasa Inggris. Tapi baik, Pak Manguin ini sebetulnya saya sudah kenal sejak 1991 ketika ada sebuah program yang bertajuk Indonesian Field School of Archaeology di Trawulan. Nah, kita membicarakan pada saat itu temuan-temuan atau hal-hal yang terkait dengan Sriwijaya, Majapahit. Nah, di situ kami cukup intens berbicara dengan Pak Manguin dan saya sangat menghormati beliau karena pengetahuannya tentang Sriwijaya. Waktu itu juga ada Pak John Miksik yang juga menulis soal Sriwijaya. Paham saya ketika itu dan sampai hari ini bahwa berdasarkan cerita atau penuturan dari Pak Manguin, Sriwijaya itu bertahannya sekitar 700 tahun dan kemudian pusat kuasa itu bisa berpindah-pindah. Itu yang kemudian dianut oleh para para arkeolog yang menggeluti soal Sriwijaya. Dan ada fakta-fakta empirik yang kita temukan, yang arkeolog temukan untuk mendukung pernyataan bahwa pusat kuasa Sriwijaya itu berpindah-pindah, atau paling tidak ada pusat-pusat kekuasaan Sriwijaya yang terpencar. Nah, itu menjadi menarik sekali kemudian ketika kita hubungkan dengan misalnya Majapahit yang yang menggeliat dan mulai tumbuh kembali, tumbuh sesudah keruntuhan Majapahit, keruntuhan Sriwijaya. Nampaknya memang karena sikon memungkinkan atau bisa menjadikan Sriwijaya menjadi begitu populer, begitu kuat, dan begitu perkasa, yaitu maritim. Artinya apa? Sriwijaya mengembangkan diri selama 700 tahun, ini poin yang kedua, karena Sriwijaya mengembangkan maritim. Lalu kemudian tidak enak disebut, tapi seperti itu yang terjadi. Sriwijaya mulai menurun, lalu muncullah Majapahit. Dan Majapahit itu bisa bertahan selama 350 tahun. Terdiri atas dua fase sebetulnya. Majapahit itu menjadi kuat dan perkasa di paruh pertama 350 tahun itu. Dan berikutnya Majapahit, elit-elit Majapahit asik bertengkar, lalu kemudian tidak sadar bahwa ada Demak. Ada Demak di utaranya yang jaraknya tidak lebih dari 100 km. Kembali kepada Sriwijaya. Sriwijaya ini kemudian melahirkan banyak sekali ahli-ahli yang terkait dengan Sriwijaya itu sendiri. Misalnya ada almarhum Tommy, teman baik kita, dan juga teman baiknya Pak Manggen. Nah, kembali kepada Majapahit. Majapahit itu kemudian menjadi lemah ketika elit-elitnya asik berkontestasi sambil mereka kemudian membangun proyek-proyek yang sifatnya mercusuar tanpa mereka sadari bahwa ada Demak di utara yang jaraknya tidak lebih dari 100 km. Dari titik itu kita bisa melihat bahwa ternyata ada sebuah kontinuitas yang bisa terjadi. Tetapi ada patahan-patahan, ada luka-luka yang kemudian bisa memberikan patahan kepada proses sejarah itu. Saya kira lalu kemudian sebelum sampai ke poinnya, ada beberapa hal yang harus dicatat, bahwa Indonesia kemudian digemari atau disukai oleh banyak scholar-scholar, banyak sarjana-sarjana yang berasal dari Eropa, yang kemudian nanti tahun 2000-an itu pindah ke Australia. Nah, nampaknya Indonesia ini kemudian dibagi atas dua bagian, secara temporalis juga dibagi menjadi secara space, bahwa sarjana-sarjana Eropa kemudian melibatkan dirinya pada penelitian-penelitian yang terkait dengan geografi Indonesia bagian barat, Jawa dan Indonesia bagian barat, lalu kemudian Indonesia bagian timur ini kemudian banyak Belanda dan banyak juga Australia tahun 2000-an terutama untuk Australia. Nah, kehadiran sarjana-sarjana Belanda ini kemudian bisa dipahami mengingat pada sebelum 1900 itu kita masih ada dalam koloni Belanda. Walaupun orang Belanda sendiri misalnya tidak akan sangat menyenangi kata kolonisasi itu. Tapi terlepas dari itu ada fakta. Nah, secara teoritik apa yang ingin dijelaskan oleh Pak Manguin ini terkait dengan teori besar yang pernah atau yang digeluti atau yang dianut oleh beberapa sarjana kita, misalnya teori pembagian masyarakat dan skala watak masyarakat oleh Elman Service. Elman Service kemudian berdasarkan penelitian-penelitian yang terkait dengan dua fase ini, yaitu di Afrika, dia menemukan bahwa ternyata pembagian watak dan masyarakat tidak harus selalu seperti itu, ada lompatan-lompatan, tetapi paling tidak dimulai dengan bench yang anggotanya mungkin 10 orang, dan ini sangat arkeologis sekali. Lalu mungkin ada segmentary society, baru berikutnya ada kemudian chiefdom, dan ada early state. Nah, Elman Service memberikan kemudian kerangka teoretik soal early state, termasuk di dalamnya adalah penarikan pajak, adanya tentara, dan adanya kelompok-kelompok misalnya dukun atau priest atau ada apapun. Tetapi juga selain itu Elman Survey juga melihat dalam era early stage itu adanya bangunan-bangunan pusat, bangunan-bangunan yang menjadi pusat ritual dan seterusnya. Nah, sayang sekali saya tidak tahu apakah Pak Manguin nanti ini akan membicarakan relevansi antara pembagian skala watak masyarakat dari Elman Service dalam kerangka teoretiknya, karena menurut perbincangan saya dengan Pak Ihsan, dosen dari arkeologi, Departemen Arkeologi Universitas Hasanuddin yang pernah sekolah di UI, itu kemudian menjelaskan pada saya bahwa sarjana Prancis biasanya tidak secara sembunyi atau tidak pernah menyatakan kutipan-kutipannya dalam bentuk kutipan-kutipannya tentang apa yang dilakukan oleh koleganya. Kita tahu bahwa Prancis itu gudangnya pemikiran-pemikiran strukturalisme. Kita tahu bahwa di sana ada Foucault, kita tahu ada Bourdieu. Nah, masalahnya kemudian adalah pertanyaannya kemudian yang mengemuka kemudian adalah apakah Pak Manguin ini juga menggunakan strukturalisme dalam soal itu. Tetapi ada hal yang menarik dari para sejarawan atau para arkeolog yang kemudian juga menjadi sejarawan di belahan Eropa, terutama Eropa Barat dan Eropa Timur misalnya, yaitu arkeologi ini kemudian dibaurkan dengan dibaurkan dengan sejarah. Nah, contoh-contoh bukan contoh tetapi faktor-faktor yang mengikat mereka itu selalu ada terkait dengan misalnya ada angka-angka tahun, ada perubahan-perubahan di situ, dan itu akan menjadi menarik sekali ketika seorang Manguin akan membicarakan soal early stage di Southeast Asia. Tetapi saya ingin mengundang sekali lagi kepada Pak Manguin untuk datang ke Sulawesi Selatan untuk membicarakan bagaimana melihat early stage di Sulawesi Selatan, misalnya Luwu dan Makassar, yang sedikit berbeda cara caranya berproses sehingga lahir sebuah early stage seperti itu. Misalnya beberapa kerajaan-kerajaan kecil, tanda kutip kerajaan, kita tidak tahu apakah benar itu kerajaan atau tidak. Beberapa toponim-toponim yang diduga di dalam naskah Lontara sebagai kerajaan itu kemudian menggabungkan diri, lalu kemudian penggabungan ini kemudian menjadikan penggabungan yang lebih besar, dan yang lebih besar ini kemudian menjadi lebih besar lagi, lalu kemudian lahirlah sebuah negara seperti Luwu dan Makassar. Kebetulan saya juga sempat membantu misalnya Bulbek soal kerajaan Goa, dan saya melihat bahwa ternyata ada perbedaan yang cukup signifikan antara Jawa, Asia Tenggara, dan juga Jawa, Indonesia Timur, dan juga bagian Southeast Asia lainnya soal lahirnya early state. Saya kira perbincangan kita itu akan menjadi sangat menarik karena kita berhadapan dengan seorang Manguin yang hampir lebih dari setengah umurnya membicarakan soal Sriwijaya. Terima kasih untuk kesempatan ini, Bapak Moderator.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Iwan Sumantri, for your introduction. It's very rich introduction that enlightened us about today's discussion. Okay, before continue with Monsieur Manguin and answer the question, I would like to remind our participant, don't forget to follow our Instagram, the Development Study Club in Instagram. Okay, and then in the main session, Monsieur Manguin will present the main topics about the early states and the rise of nation in Southeast Asia. Monsieur Manguin, je vous laisse la parole et vous pouvez répondre également les questions de Monsieur Iwan Sumantri. Vous avez environ 45 jusqu'à 60 minutes.
D'accord, merci. Terima kasih. Terima kasih Pak Iwan juga. I'm sorry, Pak Iwan, maybe I will not answer all your questions in what I have prepared today. Indonesia is too big a nation to be able to be a specialist of every region. And as far as I'm concerned, I've been a few times to Sulawesi Selatan, but mostly to study ships and shipbuilding, not so much the state. But that was long ago in the late 70s. Now, if I may, I will share my screen to present my PowerPoint and use it for, so share my screen, okay. Let me find my PowerPoint and put it online. Oops. Right, can you see it?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Yes.
Very clear.
Good. Yes, I hope to be able to say all this in 3/4 of an hour, maybe an hour if I'm a bit too talkative. The subject I was asked to deal with today, early states, the rise of nation in Southeast Asia, is very vast. In fact, it's too vast for 3/4 of an hour. So I will have to be very selective in the matters that I will deal with. Clearly, I will use the matter or the data that we have gathered with all my Indonesian colleagues over the past 50 years almost on Sriwijaya. I will try to show you how paradigms have changed since the beginning of Srivijayan studies until these days. Try to broaden it a bit, this discussion, to the rest of Southeast Asia very briefly, to show that this kind of problem can arise also when you study other areas in Southeast Asia. I have excavated in southern Vietnam, in Mekong Delta, on Funan, so I will tell you a few words about it. I should also tell you, I am not a political scientist or a sociologist. I am a historian, trained in roughly in the Annal School of history, which means in many ways I'm more, even though I did anthropology and structuralism was very much in line at that time, I'm more of a historian and empiricist. I start from data collected from texts, and later on I moved to archaeology because there were not enough texts for what I needed. So only the archaeology could bring the answers, or some of the answers, to the questions I was thinking about. This is a general trend, you know. There is a big gap in Southeast Asian studies between, let's say, the prehistory and history, between the 5th century BC and the 5th century AD, when Indianized states, as they said during Orientalist times, were born. And there was about 1 millennium long period of time of which we knew nothing. You had very simple societies, prehistorical societies, at best Neolithic, and the other side, modern states, already large states. The very big question in the past 20 or 30 years, in Europe also, is to fill in this gap. You know, Europe developed very much at the same time as Southeast Asia. If you replace India by Rome and Southeast Asia by Western Europe, France and the Gauls and the British, you have very much the same kind of dichotomy with so-called great civilization, Rome, India, and societies that are simpler in their organization and become, as they said before, civilized at that time. But thanks to archaeology, for instance, in France, we know now that the Gauls were already Romanized before they were conquered by Caesar. They were trading with Rome and interacting with Rome hundreds of years before the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar. And this is very much what the conclusions that we've been drawing for Southeast Asian studies is that Indianization is the end of a 1,000-year process of interaction between Southeast Asia and India. So it is within this general framework that I want to talk to you today. I need to go through very briefly because, again, I'm not a theoretician or anything like that. But since we're talking about the state, we're talking about the nation, we need a few definitions. The definition of the state that is most common, that the vast majority of scholars accept, is that by sociologist Max Weber. Basically, it became popular after the Second World War. The state is a human community that claims the monopoly of force, of legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Weber defines this as an idealtype with various criteria. The principles is monopoly, legitimacy, the force, the idea of community, of territory. You don't have all these in a state, but you need to have most of them if you want to talk about a state. The definitions about early polities depend very much on the context. The definitions are fluid, depending if you look at what John Miksic, for instance, you were alluding to John Miksic, or I define as a, let's say, chronology of Srivijaya, we don't put the periods exactly at the same way. These are matter of emphasis on some aspects of state, on the others. It doesn't really matter. The important is the process. It's a long process that goes from chiefdoms to what you can call proto-states. Some people will call them already early states, the definitions, and then into more sophisticated states, early states. Some of them can be defined as city-states. This is the case of Srivijaya in my view. But again, we have to be very careful because the data we have is still very poor. And the history of Srivijaya is something extremely difficult to write. There are practically no inscriptions except for the foundation inscriptions. After the dozen inscriptions in the 680s, you have practically no more inscriptions until the end of Srivijaya. This is very different from Java, where you can document history of Java. You can understand how the state functions because you have inscriptions. In Srivijaya, you don't have. All you have is archaeology or foreign testimonies, Chinese, Indian, Arabs, etc. So one has to be very careful, and all this is always provisional, moving, and definitions are changing. And what I will try to do is summarize more or less what we have been doing with my Indonesian colleagues and other historians in the past few years. The nation is something a lot more political. It's a cultural, it's a political community. It's something, it's a community that is conscious of its autonomy. I don't want to go into details. One should remember, though, that a scholar like Ben Anderson, who is very often quoted when you talk about the nation, is a specialist of Indonesia who has built up his model very much on the basis of Indonesian states and nations. And he talks about imagined communities because the nation is something that is a narrative that you have to build up. A historian provides the facts, a political scientist will build up a narrative and to help create an identity for a nation, etc. Nationalism, bringing the state and the nation together, is something that is very recent. It developed in historical thought and political thought in Europe only after the 18th century. So all these concepts should not be mixed. The state is something neutral. Nation is already something that is political, that is part of a narrative. The nations can be built up from various criteria. It can be ethnic, and certainly Sriwijaya with Melayu as an identity, the language itself, but also the kingdom that was called Melayu at the beginning. All this helps build up the thing, but sometimes it can be multi-ethnic, of course. Certainly Sriwijaya provided a very practical, convenient narrative for nation building. I will return to that a bit later. Now, Sriwijaya, well, I put on maps. Sometimes I lecture to people who are not familiar with Indonesia. Of course, now I'm lecturing to Indonesians who know their map, not as well as I do, but just to place Sriwijaya within a map of Southeast Asia, and in red with all the trade routes. You know, I'm a maritime historian more than anything else. I've worked mostly on coastal societies, and so I always liked to link the data with what goes on in the broader scale of the whole of Southeast Asia or even of the world, as you will see a bit later. So Sriwijaya is basically conceived around this area. It is not, as we will see, it's not a state with borders. It is more a federation of city-states. At least this is how I understand it, and most people would now understand it this way, with a core territory that could be called Wanua Sriwijaya in inscriptions, and built around two different keratuan, the first one in Palembang that was founded in the 680s, and after it moved to Jambi, another one, but we don't have inscriptions telling us that, but most probably there was a keratuan Sriwijaya in Jambi too, after the 11th century. Now, as you know well, the foundation of Sriwijaya sometime in the 680s. We have two inscriptions giving us a narrative already of the foundation. There is, and since the state, one of the main definitions of state is the use of force to, without force and an army and navy, etc., you cannot create a state. These narratives that are provided by local inscriptions already provide you with some of the elements. The king of Sriwijaya at the foundation time leads an expedition against his enemies. We don't know exactly which enemies yet. This is not quite, but at least there is an expedition, and this expedition is sent into the field under the command of the ruler, the Datu of Sriwijaya, and these enemies, as rebels, may be punished if they don't acknowledge the supremacy of Sriwijaya. All this was known from the beginning when George Coedes, in a way, discovered on paper, of course, he never set foot in Sumatra, this kingdom of Sriwijaya, the Royaume de Sriwijaya. This is the birth certificate, if you wish, of Sriwijaya, but only for historians, of course. Sriwijaya was there before. And then a second article published also with the bulletin of the school I belong to, École Française Extrême-Orient, French Provision Studies, which I'm still presently the editor of this journal. And this was immediately picked up by Dutch historians like an archaeologist like Nicholas Crome, and he immediately after reading Coedes's article in 1918 wrote a very important paper called The Sumatran Period of Javanese History. And this was picked up by local historians, by Sumatran historians and Indonesian historians a bit later on when Indonesia became independent, such as Muhammad Yamin. I will return to that. Still, the foundation inscriptions, you have another one, which is the Kudukan Bukit inscriptions, and talking about this expedition also. The very important Sabokingking, or formerly known as Telaga Batu inscription, which is not dated, but it's exactly from the same period, around 685, more or less, was only published much later, after Indonesia had become independent, and the discourse and the narrative of Muhammad Yamin and the others, to which I will return, was already in place when this particular inscription was read by the Kasparis. It is the first inscription that really told you about the state and provides you with a local, an indigenous narrative and an indigenous perception of the state. With this Kadatuan in the center, and this was revised later, reread by Herman Kulke, again published in the Bulletin of the EFEO, where you have a different perception from that of the Kasparis. The Kasparis still had a very a perception of history of the region very much influenced by what came before. He was with different approaches, but still roughly he talked about empire. He translated Kadatuan by empire. Empire is something that is not like Srivijaya. Srivijaya is not an empire. Srivijaya is a powerful state that controlled networks, but it's not a territorial empire. Mojopahit could be said to be one. So Herman Kulke also retranslated some of these inscriptions, drew this scheme here, where he shows that in fact Kadatuan does not mean the whole of Srivijaya, but only the Keraton of Srivijaya, which is very much comparable to the Keraton of Central Java, for instance. It's a very limited place, immediately controlled by the Datu, it's the Kadatuan, and this is within Vanua, which is most probably the city of Palembang, and it starts controlling in the 7th century a certain amount of different, what the inscriptions call mandala, hence the mandala state of Oliver Walters that was used as a model for all of these states, and all these states within a very simple bureaucracy, which is mostly patrimonial, meaning that they are the family of the Datu who rule over Srivijaya at that time. So it is an early state. It is not a very sophisticated state. So this is basically how the perception of Srivijaya evolved in time on the basis of different readings of inscriptions, new models, new paradigms. But there are more important things to come that were brought by archaeology. Since we're talking about narratives, it is important also to quote Malay texts that were written down in later times, that they convey ancient histories. You know, the name Srivijaya has completely disappeared from Malay texts. Before the inscriptions were found, not a single text referred to Srivijaya. Basically, they referred to Andalas, which is Sumatra, or to other places, but not to Srivijaya by its name. Nevertheless, the narrative at the beginning of the Sejarah Melayu, which you will find also in the Hikayat Hang Tua, or with different details in Hikayat Banjarmasin, for instance, etc., is always about the foundation of a new state, Negeri, Negara, that they called Palembang in the country of Andalas. And this new state is founded on a hill. It is important to remember that this is a hill, and you will see why I think this is important. And this hill is called Bukit Seguntang, which is a local name, but it carries also an Indianized name, Mahameru. And the Meru is, as you know, very important as a symbolic mountain for any kingdom or any city. Any city in India or in Southeast Asia needs to have a mountain as a symbol of the relationship with the divinities and the political power and the divinities. So you have in this narrative already all the ingredients to build a state. The first Orientalist paradigm, I told you already, with the Kasparis, considered Srivijaya as something that was born out of the blue. Because we knew nothing, they knew, and we at the beginning, when we started working in South Sumatra, knew absolutely nothing of what was going on before Srivijaya. Everything started with the inscriptions in the 680s. We knew there was Melayu a bit earlier in Jambi, and that was about all. So that, let's call it Orientalist paradigm, really was what was widely accepted. And that left chronological no man's land between late prehistory. There were some prehistoric remains of the Huabinian times or others, and there wasn't much about Neolithic in South Sumatra, at least. So we needed to really fill in this gap. And the person who really started filling this gap in did it on the basis of texts, only on Chinese texts. And this is, of course, I forgot to put the reference here, but you all know it, and it has been translated into Indonesian too. It's Oliver Waters, who was my mentor in much of this historian's, my career as historian. Oliver Waters, in his book, Early Indonesian Commerce, where he postulates on the basis of texts only. There was no finds yet, no archaeology in downstream from Palembang. He postulates that there was a favored coast along the Straits of Bangka where early kingdoms would have developed. Early states, early policies, call it what you want. It's always difficult to put a precise label on them, and I'll return again to that. Palembang itself, briefly, all this is very well known. It was known through the inscriptions I told you about. It was known through a few statues that were found there. Don't forget that for the Dutch archaeologists, Palembang had no big monuments. It had no Borobudur, no Prambanan, nothing compared to Angkor, for instance, or Pagan. So they were not very much interested. And the Uitgevoerkunstdienst, the Dinas Purbakala, very rarely sent somebody there, and only amateurs like Schnitger, like other people, did archaeology in South Sumatra. So what was there when they excavated this statue, which is a very important Buddhist statue that dates from the beginning of Srivijaya, not as early as they thought, but at least from 7th, 8th century. When this statue was excavated, they didn't even bother to do a proper excavation. They just dug it out. And in fact, in photographs of the excavation, we found that they had found inscriptions. There was a stupa behind, underneath it, and all this. So they really didn't care much about all this. After, let's say, 20 years, we started working again on this in the very late 70s. Then with, there was no Balai Arkeologi yet, but with the late regretted Pak Bambang Pudiotomo, with other friends, and then Suroso, Pa Suroso, my very good friend. We worked together for 20 years in Sumatra with Pa Suroso. We started working on that, and little by little came up with a reasonably coherent picture of what Palembang and as the capital of Srivijaya would have been. This is a map that was recreates on the basis of satellite imagery and other things, the environment of Srivijaya, that it's empty at the beginning in the center for the good reason. This is a dense part of town. You cannot excavate there. So there are practically no sites except for this one in the garden of the former governor's palace. So we could have the garden to excavate, but the rest is buildings only. Most of the excavations were carried out east and west, because this is where there was still ground for excavations. Now it's completely covered with city. But in the 70s and 80s, West Palembang was still open for excavation. The important thing is we can identify religious sites, inscriptions, sites that are political and religious activities, and some sites like the Museum Badarudin site that are settlement sites or dedicated to trade and commerce. So there are all the components of a city, a true city, and we have the elements, thanks to the inscriptions and all this, of a true state. I'm not going to develop this here, but I wrote a paper on that, but I believe that the Weber concept of city-state is what fits best for this kind of city-state, like Malacca later, or like Demak, or like others. Excavations, briefly, we came up in the Museum Badarudin garden, just close to the river. We came up with, this is one stratigraphy among many others, but in the layer A, the very early part of Sriwijaya is not represented in Badarudin. It starts with the second phase of Sriwijaya in Shailendra times, with the 9th century here. Then with the later part of Sriwijaya, when the capital has already moved to Jambi, it's not as dense. Goes on straight with the early Sultanate, 14th to 17th century. It starts in the 16th century. Then it's filled in, and only later there is the third palace of the Sultan built around here. It's not on that particular excavation because the buildings would have, we found the buildings, but not in this particular square, excavation square. Then it was filled in Dutch times to provide for this garden of the residency of the governor. Just to show you the kind of results that we achieved during all these excavations in Badarudin, which is very important for the kind of settlement of habitat, of housing that was that of Sriwijaya. And that explains very much why there is nothing in Palembang that is comparable to, let's say, Angkor. Orientalists were looking for Angkor in Sriwijaya. They didn't find Angkor because there was no Angkor. Sriwijaya was made of wood, largely. It was made on the riverbank. It was built very much like this. I mean, some of the buildings would have been a lot more beautiful than these, of course, but Sriwijaya is something that left few traces on the ground, contrary to Angkor, where the landscape is completely transformed. It's a different type of state. It's an agrarian state, which provides a completely different set of remains for archaeologists to work on. But it doesn't mean that Sriwijaya was not important. And Arabic traders of Baghdad and Chinese traders of China at that time, when you had those big powers, rich cities, they all say that Sriwijaya king in the 9th, 10th century is one of the biggest kings in Asia and the more powerful ones. And it has left few traces to be seen by archaeologists, except this kind of trace, of course. We found material proof of all this activity of trade in terms of ceramics, starting in the 9th century. You have here Chinese ceramics from the south of China. These are more precious ones, very few of these, but they are there. Some Changsha ware, Ding ware, Yue type wares, and Guangdong wares. Some of them were already copied in the Middle East, and these are Middle Eastern wares, Persian Gulf wares that are copies of this, and within the same site you find the original and the copy, which shows you already how much exchange there was between Middle East and Sriwijaya. And these are Middle Eastern wares too. Later on you have, this is already 12th century, again what is called lusterware, which comes from the Middle East in small quantities, but they do attest to the fact that we know it from written sources. Merchants from all over the world came to Srivijaya. Very briefly, conclusions: the capital in Palembang, the trade in ceramics was absolutely enormous, around 800 to 1,000, 1,050. And then, as we know also from Professor Walters's article on the shift of the capital to Jambi, we have a second period where in Palembang, the volume of trade becomes much smaller because it shifts to the Batanghari further north. And we also found traces of temples. I was telling you the habitat, the settlement is on water, is on wood, but temples, the sacred places, have to be out of reach of water. So they have to be on the hills. Bukit Seguntang is one hill. Sabokingking was probably one hill too. This is a bit ambiguous, but I can't go into detail. Another hill that had left some remains to be transferred to the Museum Nasional in Jakarta, which was not yet called Museum Nasional, is a place called Candi Angsoka, which is in the center of town, on the first hill, just as you go up to Jalan Sudirman on the way to the airport. And we couldn't excavate the center of it because there is a tomb of Sultanate, 19th century, 18th century tomb. But we were allowed to excavate on the side of that tomb, a few meters away from it, and we did find the remains of a temple with dates here. This layer here, very dense settlement layer, dates to the 8th, 9th century, and the temple was built immediately after that. And the statues that were found on this hill that were sent to Museum Nasional are really 9th to 10th century, so that fits. So we found also a few traces of temples. We found some, this is probably on Bukit Seguntang, but most of it had been destroyed. The layers are very close to the surface. We found some traces of probably an asrama of Buddhist monks on the hill, but usually, you know, you can't go any further because excavating any further would mean destroy the bathroom of this, the owner of this house. So it's always a problem in Palembang. We also relocated or newly located statues that were without context in museums by going through the archives and going back to the sites where they had been found, and the temple sites were found in various places. So we have now data from Palembang, also from the periphery, showing that Buddhism had expanded to the rest. We found, rediscovered, in a way, the temple complex of Bumiayu, which is on the Lamatang River. All this really brought flesh to what was Srivijaya. Nobody can say now that Srivijaya is not in Palembang and in South Sumatra. What exactly is Srivijaya is another question, but that there was there a polity, a state, powerful state that built temples in specific places, and that had religious activities, economic activities, political activities is now no longer open to question. Also international, this was known before already in Orientalist times. We know that the Buddhism, Srivijaya as a center of Buddhism, was absolutely essential. It was a place of learning where Buddhist monks from China spent years learning Sanskrit before they went to India or returning from India, and where they translated the basic texts of Buddhism, the canonical texts of Buddhism, into Chinese. I Ching was the first one to do that in the 7th century, but you have plenty of other traces of this kind of connection with China and with India. Inscription by the king of Srivijaya in Chinese in Guangdong. You have this Nalanda inscription at the Nalanda site in Nalanda, which is one of the big centers of Buddhism, and where this asrama, this monastery was built by Indian, most probably, but it was ordered and it was chartered by Balaputra Dewa, king of Srivijaya, as we know from this inscription. So you see, all this really proves that Srivijaya was a powerful state with a sphere of influence that covered most of Asia from India to China. And this is this kind of importance that was used by, now we're going into political sciences a bit, by somebody like Muhammad Yamin. If you go through all these titles here that I got out of my bibliographic database, you see that we are really into nation building. We are now from state moving into a nation. I'm not going to go into all this detail. You know it as much better than I do, probably. But it is important. But this is the end result, 54, 56, until 65. I think Yamin died in 66, I think, if I remember well. But Muhammad Yamin had started as intellectual from Sumatra. This newly revealed past of Srivijaya, after the publication of the inscription by Coedes, their discussion by Crome, was immediately put to use by Sumatran intellectuals. And it was used in the quest for identity of the first nationalist organizations, the Young Sumatran Bond, the League of Young Sumatrans, that was organized. All this is the beginning of the Indonesian nation. I mean, that lived from 70, was active between 17, just before Srivijaya was found, and 1930. And you have intellectuals there like Amir, possibly less well known than the others, Muhammad Yamin, of course, who became Minister of Education, and Muhammad Hatta, who is all these Sumatran intellectuals, who was one of those who wrote the constitution. So what emerges in these years, first, is a Sumatran nation. The term that they use is suku bangsa for nation, that shares a language, which is Malay, that controls the Malacca Straits, and a unique history of prosperous trading kingdoms. But this shifts as nationalist sentiments grow in Indonesia in the 30s. The young Sumatran born joins Indonesia Muda, and we start from provincial identity. We move from provincial identity to a national identity. And Muhammad Yamin himself, in a speech in 45, just before the constitution was written, it's a meeting called Badan untuk Melidiki Usaha-usaha Persiapkan Kemerdekaan, he declares that Srivijaya has to be considered by the first Negara Indonesia. And the future President Sukarno himself, he's not yet the president, just a few weeks later, will he be, said a few days later that Srivijaya, and he adds Mojopahit, had attained in the past, the state of Merdeka, and of, Dutch is still used at that time, Nationalstaat, national state, that encompasses the whole of Indonesia. It is a view of Srivijaya that has been challenged recently, but the narrative is there. It was used and put to very good use by these nationalists. What I would like to show you is that what we have found recently in Sumatra may change slightly how Muhammad Yamin saw this empire of Srivijaya covering the whole nation, but it doesn't change the basics of it. About this, I wrote a little article called Welcome to Bumi Srivijaya that was published. It's available online in ICs in Singapore. This is a map that was drawn in Muhammad Yamin's Atlas Sejarah, which shows roughly what we consider is not the territory of Srivijaya. That is the big difference. We don't think of territories anymore, but at least the sphere of interaction, the main sphere of interaction of Srivijaya. The Thais claim this to be this is Malaysia, of course, today. This is Thailand, or the rest, of course, is Indonesia. But the modern borders had no, of course, in Srivijayan times, had no I mean, they're not there. They're just not there. The idea of a nation called Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand is not in the pipes yet. But it is interesting to see that it does very much cover what we consider to be the interaction sphere, let's call it like that, of Srivijaya. National narratives in Thailand, I'll be very brief. For one, I can't read Thai, so I cannot go into this kind of narrative in the actual language of the Thais. But you can, some of what is Srivijaya has been used in a national narrative of Thailand. And what has been used is a rather neutral thing called Suvarnabhumi. The airport in Bangkok, Suvarnabhumi, is Suvarnabhumi, which is the land of gold. And you have this, it's one of the books that were published, this one, it's a government booklet commemorating the birthday, the 80th birthday of the late king. That was in 2019. This is the Buddhist area, of course. Suvarnabhumi or Suvarnadvipa in Indian sources of the beginning of the first millennium is a designation of the lands of gold, the islands of gold, and this is the whole of Southeast Asia. Now it is claimed by Thailand to be their land, but you should remember that Suvarnadvipa was used in the inscription by Adityavarman in Minangkabau country in Western Sumatra, saying that his kingdom, his realm is Suvarnadvipa. So everybody claims it, and recently an inscription popped up in Cambodia where they use Suvarnadvipa or Suvarnabhumi, I forgot, also to describe this land. In fact, Suvarnabhumi, Suvarnadvipa is the whole of Southeast Asia seen from India. It's the lands of gold where gold was exported and rich. So it is used in national narratives, but Thailand, these are two examples. You have the city of, in a Nepalese manuscript, but the legend to the depiction of a Lokanatha Buddha, Bodhisattva. It's Suvarnabhumi, you see, it's in the city of gold in Srivijaya, in the city of Srivijaya. It's a 10th or 11th century manuscript. In a Buddhist translation, it's only preserved in a Buddhist translation of a Buddhist text called Durbodaloka that was written by the son of the king of Srivijaya in, I believe, Palembang in the early 11th century. This text, he was the professor of Atisha, who was the founder of modern Buddhism in Tibet. And in the colophon of the translation by Atisa of this Buddhaloka, it says that Dharmakirti composed this text in the city of Srivijaya of Suvarnadvipa in the 10th regnal year of this king, which is basically the early 11th century. So you see that Suvarnadvipa can be claimed by everybody. You could have a narrative in Indonesia saying Suvarnadvipa is also a notion that can be used for nation building. But then it has to be shared with Cambodia, with Thailand, etc. Varavati is also a problem for Thailand. There's a lot written about Varavati, which is as elusive as Srivijaya is, which is basically six around this area. But Varavati is a Mon state. You don't forget that the Thais created the kingdom of Thailand, of Siam, at Ayutthaya, in the 12th, 13th century. The Times came down from the north quite late in time. Before that, the people were not Thai speakers, they were Mon speakers. Mon is akin to Khmer, Mon Khmer languages. Burma is the same thing, with the Burmese coming down and and taking over the territory from the Mons. They have survived as a minority in Burma. In Thailand, they have been completely absorbed. So creating the Malays could have a narrative because they had a Malay language and a Malay ethnic area. Whereas in Thailand, the Thais are from a different group. it is more difficult for them to use a narrative which is written by another group of people. So there is no, I don't think there is much in terms of nation-building narrative using Varavati, but I may be wrong. I'm not too familiar with that kind of literature. Now, to the new paradigms. I'll try to be quick. Yes. We needed to fill this no man's land between the 5th century BC and the 5th century AD. And one essential little booklet that was published by a prehistorian, Ian Glover, who had started working on sites of the 4th to 1st century BC in Thailand, Bandung Tapet, came up with this idea that all this, because he had found a lot of artifacts that came from India, that came from South China Sea, even some of them coming from further west across India, from Rome, he decided that this should be linked to the world trade system. And this is the essential part of all these new paradigms for Indonesian, Thailand, Malaysian history. There are plenty of things happening during that millennium-long no man's land between prehistory and history. And Indianization is not the origin of all things modern in Southeast Asia. It's the result of 1,000 years of exchange, of interaction between Southeast Asia and India. And you could say the same between Vietnam and or Champa and China, for instance, on the other side. Very briefly, just to show you that during this no man's land between 5th and 4th, or 5th and 5th, depending what you count, you have all the Dongsun drums that are spread all over Southeast Asia. They certainly indicate a common religious thought or some kind of possibly political thought, but at least shared values all along the trade networks of Southeast Asia. One very important marker is Indian wares, ceramic wares, the famous rouleted wares that were found first in Buni, and the 2 pieces are in the National Museum in Jakarta, but that was then found in many other sites all over Southeast Asia, and of course in India, where they were produced, and that mark again that there are extensive relations between India and Southeast Asia. Other types of ceramics in lesser quantities also appear. Other types of objects appear also all around these sites. I can't go into the detail of all this because it would take me hours. I'll just show you, which defines a kind of interaction sphere again in Western Southeast Asia that overlaps with an interaction sphere with the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea, with big nodes in the peninsula, because there's a route crossing there, and this is the landfall for ships going from India to Southeast Asia. Quite a few nodes of activity. A lot of work has been done on all this recently. One of my former students, Berenice Bellina, published on Khao Samkher, which is at the north part of the Thai Malay Peninsula. And they have published a lot. This is one summary of their excavations. They are now working on other sites there. Plenty of sites have been found on this northern part of the peninsula. Berenice Bellina sometimes tends to think, we may differ. She calls it a port city. I wouldn't call it yet a city, maybe a proto-urban settlement, but well, she would like it to be a settlement, but every archaeologist would like to have his own site bigger than it is. This is a general trend among archaeologists. If you apply this to the Musi River, you now have a completely different picture, because sites were found. We knew for long the rather developed megalithic societies of Pasema and all these places. I'm not going to talk about that because we don't have time, but the new sites are basically found in all this area along the coast. And they are linked to the polities that function upriver in the mountains, in the fertile plateaus of Pasama and all these areas. They function very much within these river basins, with the Batanghari River Basin here, or the Musi River Basin, the Batanghari Sembilan, as it is called. And all this links, of course, to trade networks, maritime trade networks. Most of what has been found has been brought together in this book recently published by the late Patomi, Bambang Budi Utomo. And the title itself tells you that the environment, the landscape is very different. We are now talking about lahan gambut, wetland. And a lot of wetland archaeology has been developing because this is where this kind of remain is best preserved. Same thing in Europe, in New Guinea now, in Irian maybe also. Nur Hadi Rangkuti and others have been working on that, publishing on that too. I've summarized more or less all that has been done in an article when we had a meeting organized by the late Professor Karashima at Toyobuku in Tokyo, on the origins of state, on state formation, social integration. And I talked about all this, tried to summarize all that was being done, had been done by us, and was being done by Indonesian archaeologists long after I stopped working on it. This is a very rapid overview of what was found. Our first survey, that was in 86, I think, of when these transmigration grounds were opened in these wetlands downriver from Palembang, in Air Sugian first. This is the kind of survey we had to do, which is not exactly comfortable, but that was the way it was. It had to be done. You can see me, or Ibu Retno, if I'm not wrong here, and Pasuroso here, surveying these areas, trying to find traces of it at the beginning in 2000, between 2001. And the first test pits and excavations were carried out still within the end of the Sriwijaya project. That project came to an end at that time. I had to shift to Vietnam for a while. And we had the first carbon datings of these wooden posts to 4th to 6th century AD. That was very clearly pre-Sriwijaya. It also showed like the sites excavated by Glover, like the sites excavated by Berenice Bellina in Thailand, that we had contacts with the rest of the world. You have a comparison of 3 objects found in Karangagung in Sumatra Selatan, in Musi Banyuasin, compared with those that were found in Okeo, in Funan. They are contemporary, let's say 3rd, 4th, 5th century, something like that. Objects like these, you have here, this kind of object found in Air Sugian, but look at this mold for making these objects. This was found in Funan, in the Mekong Delta. These beads are found all over the place. These photographs were supplied by Agustianto, with whom I've worked a lot, particularly in Batu Jaya. These filigree beads in gold were found all over the place, from Okeo, southern China, Air Sugian, in Burma, in Khao Som Keo. You see that this sphere of interaction of all these sites is very important, and this is still before the 5th century. A lot was found in terms of earthenwares, imported ceramics, beads, bronze, timbers, houses and boats during all these excavations that were carried out by the Puslit Arkenas people, now called Brin. This is probably the kind of environment, landscape that you would have had at that time. This is a photograph I took myself in the 80s, but basically what you have is a group of sites, including Kota Kapur, the earliest phase of the 2nd, 3rd century, Air Sugian, at Karangagung, all these were cleared by transmigrasi, so that revealed the sites. Tanabang is a bit earlier. You have also, they're not as well known, but they go on in Bayang Lincir here, also in Lebak Bandung, which is basically Kota Jambi. And then a transition phase, which is not very well known. We knew about Melayu because Itzing was there in the 670s. And when he was there, he learned that Srivijaya had been founded in Palembang. So Melayu is there, and the name itself is very, it speaks of the ethnic build of all these polities. But we have, thanks to Oliver Walters and his early Indonesian commerce, we know that this was what he called the favored coast, a coast that, according to Chinese sources, would have been favored by traders. And there is one of the polities there called Kantoli, that I put a question mark because we don't have the proof that these sites are Gantoli. And in the sites that were excavated so far, there were no traces of Buddhism yet. A lot of work has to be done still. So still a question mark, but most probably Gantoli is one of these early states, proto-states that were born around this area. Then Srivijaya and its expansion and whatever. Kota Kapur is then one of the transition polities there. It's a competitor to Srivijaya. It's a Vaishnava network, not a Buddhist network. And it is pre-Srivijaya. In fact, the inscription of Kota Kapur, which is a Srivijaya inscription, tells of the destruction of what was there before. And it's a new established power, which is Buddhist, competing against a Vaishnava earlier group of sites that are linked to Funan and the Thai Malay Peninsula, etc. This is what we found, a small Vaishnava temple where the Vishnu statues were found. Again, I can't go, this is late 6th century, still pre-Srivijaya, and this is most probably what was destroyed by one of the expeditions of Srivijaya. So we have a longer sequence now with first, no central place, but groups of sites of early states, proto-states. We don't know enough yet to really define them. On the coast, we had megalithic civilization in the upper lands. We know they had bronze drums, so they were in touch with the world networks. Then foundation and the creation of two central places in Melayu first, and then in Palembang, and then returning to Jambi later. They become central places. We found most of the temples now, and it takes after the 9th century for temples to be discovered and built in later places around the 9th to 30th. So we have a complete now history of pre-Srivijaya to Srivijaya, leading from the early first millennium all the way to the 13th century, to the fall of Srivijaya. This does not affect Muhammad Yamin. Had he known that, it wouldn't have changed his discourse, because this is the origins of Srivijaya. It is not yet a true state, but it is there. And Srivijaya doesn't pop up like that out of nowhere. It is, right. This is one model, you've seen it all around the place, that shows how all these polities function, upriver, downriver, going into the upper valleys, etc., Palembang, Jambi. So there is a new paradigm, the shift of the political power to Palembang from the lowlands, and that happens when Srivijaya is founded, from the floodplain of the favored coast to the firmer ground. And that's where you have the first hills, Bukit Seguntang, Chandiang Soka, etc. This is a passage from chiefdoms to proto-states, to early states, and from coastal settlements that are possibly proto-urban, we need to know more, to something which is a real city-state. Melayu, we have so little that it's very difficult to talk about it. This Buddha, which is a national museum, comes from Solok Sipin, which is in the town of Jambi. But how can you excavate in the middle of a town? You see the remains of this site, which is probably from Melayu or very early Srivijaya. But Buddha statues were found that are certainly early 6th, 7th century, possibly pre-Srivijayan, very upriver from Jambi. So we clearly have something, but it still has to be documented. Batu Jaya, I have to be quick here now, but we have the same pattern again. You have temples that are built after the 7th century. Let's say it's the beginning of the classical period. These date from before the early temples of Central Java, but they are, let's call it the classical period. This is during restoration. Candi Blandongan now is fully restored. Our work there, the cooperation between the EFEO and Pusitar Kenas, was not on the temples themselves. This was the BPT guys that took care of that. It changed name again, I forgot a new name. We were excavating on the periphery of these temples to try and find out the chronology of the site before the temples. We had a Buddhist period clearly around the 7th century with inscriptions that have been deciphered. All this has been pretty well documented by Pa Hasan Jafar in his dissertation. We found also in earlier layers, excavating aside from the temples, a little Buddhist inscription that was kind of talisman that was folded together and that could be read, which is, the layer at least is dated to the 5th or 6th century, more or less here. But as we went down, these are the temple layers or the ruins of the temples, occupation layers, going down all the way down to the very early 1st millennium with Buni pottery. So we are here in the Buni culture of West Java, which is early 1st millennium, even possibly late first century BC. What we found is burials, and these burials are not Buddhist or Hindu. They are pre-Indianized burials with features that we find all over Southeast Asia. You have golden beads, you have iron sword here, a lot of grave goods that are basically Buni wares and rouleted ware from India, such as these or these. So we now have, as in Srivijaya, we have an Indianized face here after 550. The exact construction date of the first temple is not precisely done, which was then, for some reason we don't know of, abandoned and rebuilt. Blandongan as it stands today is the phase B reconstruction. But we also have all this long period with calibrated dates starting in 60, going all the way to 6th century, from 1st century to 6th century, with burials, early burials, later burials, all this in pre-classical times. Whether this is pre-Taruman Negara times or some other kind of times, I can't answer that. You have Vaishnava inscriptions in Taruman Negara, they're well known. Can you objectively link that to what we found in Batu Jaya? It's very difficult to say. It's possible. And it is now in Sejarah Nasional, but I'm not quite convinced yet. At least we need proof. Briefly, and I'll finish on that, Vietnam, just to show you that we have the same thing. Sites, Funan is basically constructed around 3 main urban sites. I worked here on Okeo, but now other sites were found in Jonkavo, in Prohir, that have a lot of affinities with earlier times. This is Prohir, a site which is very rich in gold artifacts that can be compared with those of Batu Jaya. Then Funan was discovered at first on paper, like Srivijaya, by Paul Pelliot on Chinese sources, again in Bulletin de l'EFEO, but 1903. Then it was discovered in the field by Louis Malray, the last few years of the EFEO, when the EFEO was still in Hanoi and Saigon, before moving to France. And this is the work that we resumed in a way. And then the Vietnamese archaeologists, as soon as the war was finished, did a lot of work, and these are the people we worked with in the field. There is a big city there that is here, a mountain. It's the local Bukit Seguntang, if you wish, and a city. Excavations that were quite intensive, where we have Funan, meaning about 3rd or 4th century here, then pre-Angkorian and even Angkorian period buildings here that are probably the lodgings of the monks of a neighboring temple, which we can't excavate because it is still used as a Buddhist temple. This was also discovered because of aerial photographs, where you have this square grid city clearly showing. This is what we tried to re-excavate by going through a variety of sites. I can't go into the details. We managed to date here, to date the moat, and the moat turned out to be, everybody said before, Malraux and others, oh, this is Indianized. It can only be after the 5th century. The moat turned up to have been dug before 220. So maybe Indian ideas of a square city, this is not indigenous in Southeast Asia, but there's no Indianization, no religions, no temples, no statues yet. So you see this transition and this long interaction with India taking place here too. On the site of EFEO properly, you see these wooden piles of large buildings that were installed somewhere at the beginning of the 1st millennium, or the late 1st millennium BC, or the beginning of the 1st millennium, and these were covered in tiles. The tiles are from an Indian model, but they were certainly made locally. You have other dates, stratigraphies, sorry, this is partly in Vietnamese, but with radiocarbon dates from the first few centuries of the Common Era, with different phases. Angkor Boré in Cambodia, Angkor in Vietnam, Got Hap in Vietnam, the 3 main sites, with the border between Vietnam and Cambodia in between the 2 sites here, which poses technical problems because Vietnamese and the Vietnam nation and the Khmer nation, the Cambodian nation, don't like each other. And they have been at war many times. So there is always a problem when you work close to the border. Different periodizations depending on the site, but the important fact is this, that we have all these sites that start before Indianization really takes place. Right, so this, just to show you, let me just stop. Right, this was to show you that the kind of change of paradigm that we witnessed in South Sumatra with the discovery of all these sites in Musi Banyuasin is something that it parallels what has been done in the rest of Southeast Asia. The idea of nation building functioned of using the local narrative and the discoveries to build up a narrative of nation building like Muhammad Yamin did, was easily done in South Sumatra. In Thailand, I showed you it's not as easy. The people have changed. The Thais are not the Mon. Vietnam is even more difficult. The Vietnamese only occupied the Mekong Delta in the 18th century. They came quite late. Vietnam originates in the northern part of Vietnam, near Hanoi. So they cannot claim this as for a narrative of nation building. The Khmer have built it up from there, but the Khmer have Angkor, and Angkor is so big and so enormous and so well known that they have enough with Angkor for nation building. They don't really need all this. So it's not so much, as far as I can see, in the national narratives yet. It might become, because what we have proved when we were excavating there were questions about who were the people of Funan. Were Austronesian speaking people, like the Chams further north on the coast of Vietnam, or Malraux thought they were Austronesians. They called them Indonesians at that time. From our excavations and those by Miriam Stark and Dutch and Khmer archaeologists on the other side of the border, it is clear that all this area was peopled and organized by Khmer people, the ancestors of the Cambodians. And there is no difference between there's no stop between in the development of the sites between first century AD all the way to the Angkorian period. So there is no stop. What brought up a stop is when the Vietnamese conquered this territory in the 18th century and it became part of Vietnam. So a national narrative is very difficult to build up on in such rather politically tense grounds. So Srivijaya is one of the best examples of a national narrative, nation-building narrative that functions nicely. Thank you for listening to me too long, as usual.
Okay.
And of course, I'm open to.
Thank you very much. Okay, in the next discussion, I will let the participant of this discussion to ask question about our topics. Maybe we can start from Sarita Diang. We have a question. Did Prof. Manguin describe Srivijaya as a city-state?
The microphone is not on.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I have a problem of connection. In the in the chat we have a question. Did Prof. Manguin describe Srivijaya as a city-state?
Yes, I believe that the model of the city-state is what fits better with this kind of state. Srivijaya is basically a city. Then it moves to Jambi, but let's talk about Palembang. It's a city which has a close relationship with the hinterland. But even in Sultanate times, the people in the hinterland are not subjects to they don't pay taxes to the Sultan. There is a contract between people in the hinterland who exploit gold, forest productions, benjoin, kuminyan, whatever is produced, timbers from the forest. There's a contract with the power in the city, and a city-state cannot live alone. It has to live with its hinterland. This is the Weber model. And it works fine for Srivijaya. We had a meeting in Copenhagen years ago, and there were 2 big volumes published where they did in this conference for a week, we did a survey, all city-states in the world. Everybody had something to say. Tony Reid was there, but talking about 15th, 16th century Sultanate times in Indonesia. I talked about earlier times. And it was quite clear that this model of a city-state fitted nicely, was a good model. But again, a model is just a tool. It's not an end per se. What the data is what has to drive you. The data that we have fits nicely within this model. Whether this model is changed by data that will be found in the future, I don't know. But for the time being, it is useful to use this model to understand what Srivijaya is and to justify why is such a territorially small state considered by the Arabs, by the Chinese, by everybody, and as one of the most powerful states of the area. It's a contradiction, or it was an apparent contradiction. But if you bring in the notion of city-state like Venice, like Genoa, like in the Mediterranean, we have plenty of examples of city-states that have a small territory, but an enormous sphere of interaction, like Venice, a bit later. But so this model, you can find some other examples in Mesoamerica, in Central America, etc. So that works. But again, I'm not a firm believer in models. Models are tools to explain the data you have at hand. And if you need to change models because the data doesn't fit anymore, then you change. Like the physicians, you know, the Big Bang and things like that, they change constantly.
Okay. Is there any question or the other? You can raise your hand in Zoom to ask question. Okay.
They're all disconnected.
Or maybe Pak yeah. Okay. Okay, Sarita Diang, okay. You can your microphone.
The microphone is off. Ah.
Okay, Sarita Diang. You can ask your question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, we could hear you.
All right.
We cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Yeah.
First.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect.
So I will just be asking a basic questions here because I'm not the historian myself. But I'm intrigued with some of the maritime history of Indonesia. So yeah, I'm curious for description of Sriwijaya as city state because as we can see, it was an enormous city that with surrounding territory forms an independent state. But I may have mislaid the explanation if you describe Sriwijaya as city state. Why do many historians still consider Sriwijaya as a maritime empire, including what we in Indonesian school thought, about Sriwijaya, because we've been taught that it's actually a maritime empire and not entirely a city. So that is my first question. And my second question is about the mandala. I think you presented it in your second slide, maybe. And you said that mandala consists of the family of Datu. And what are mandalas specifically? And are they actually Sriwijaya functionaries? Yeah, that will be all.
Yeah. Well, empire first. It's all a matter of definitions, it's a bit like models. Historians tend to use empire for states that control in a much more forceful way through territories, I mean physical territories. Sriwijaya has no borders. That's the main reason why Sriwijaya has left no inscriptions, except for the beginning, the very politically important foundation times, and then finished. Coedes said, oh, maybe they were too occupied trading and they had no religious feelings or whatever, which is not true. They were active Buddhists and a center of Buddhist learning. Why didn't they leave inscriptions? Because they have no territory. 90% of the inscriptions of Java are semi-inscriptions. They're about putting the borders of a piece of land that will be tax-free because it is run by a monastery or that will have taxes to be paid by the kingdom. And it's all about land use. There is no land use in South Sumatra. There's no agriculture. You have sago, rice comes quite late. You have sago, you have exploitation of the forest, Kemenyan, all these things are not organized with a possession of the land. Even today, when we survey in South Sumatra, the only people who know how to excavate, I mean, we need to, with my colleagues of the Pusitar Kenas, we needed often to have local workforce. The local Malays would not excavate the land. They would much prefer to gather rubber from their trees than to excavate the land, or Kemenyan from their trees, or Kelambak, or whatever. Most of the workers that we had were Javanese, transmigran, that would accept digging the land. It's a completely different mentality. The Malays traditionally were not agriculturalists. They became in colonial times and later on. But contrary to Java, which is an agricultural, not only, but, and Mojapahit is an empire because it brings together a territorial empire, Central East Java, and a control over networks, and a much more sophisticated administration, tax raising, processes, etc. And now you were talking about patrimonial. What we know is only about is from the Sabokingking inscription. But if you go back to Kulke's article of 93 or 94, you will see that the inscription talks about princes and descendants and family that are put into the various kedatuan. And then you have the external kedatuan. These are not patrimonial, but they have to be controlled militarily. They are called in the inscription mandala. The inscription uses the term mandala to describe these small polities at the periphery that are under the control of Srivijaya. And the inscriptions that were found of the same time that were found in Lampung, 2 of them, probably mark the control of Srivijaya over a mandala, which is near the Straits of Sunda. The other one in Bangsa, etc. All these mandalas, as the inscription says, were under the control of the central power, which sat at the Kadatuan in the center. Now, this mandala has been used like a gimmick by Oliver Walters. Did it very carefully, but then, as very often models, historians or people who read a bit too fast, too quickly, these things, it has become the mandala state, and you have it all over the place now, the mandala state. And sometimes very far away from what Oliver Walters said. But at least I keep to the inscription. The inscription says the mandalas are these little kingdoms, call them Kadatuan, that are far away, a bit further away from the center, Kadatuan, which is Srivijaya, Kadatuan, Srivijaya. It's a constant coming and going between models and the data. And I prefer to stay as close as possible to the data. You have to speculate a bit. That's one of the teachings of Oliver Walters, who told me, you have to speculate. You can speculate, you're allowed to speculate, but you have to say when you speculate. You have to write down, now I'm speculating. Now I'm getting away from the data. I'm just saying this is a possibility. So it's history, and archaeology is just moving between models, firm, confirmed data, and a bit of speculation. Informed speculation.
Okay. The last question maybe, is there any other question from the other? You may raise hand if you want to. Okay. Okay, no question. Okay, thank you for the answer. Okay. Okay, before close this discussion, Monsieur Manguin and Pak Iwan Sumantri, maybe could you give us the closing remark for this dense discussion? Very interesting. Maybe first from Bapak Iwan Sumantri. Silakan Bapak.
Iya. Ini rumah saya sudah dekat sekali dengan masjid. Ada speaker yang sampai ke telinga saya. Tetapi saya ingin
biasa Pak, biasa mendengar masjid nggak apa-apa.
Ya,
senang.
Iya, senang. Pak Manguin, saya tertarik sekali dengan misalnya Bukit Siguntang. Saya pernah 2-3 kali jalan-jalan ke sana, dan penjelasan Pak Manguin tadi memberikan inspirasi kepada saya soal kunjungan saya ke Bukit Siguntang. Nah, masalah kemudian adalah saya juga pernah ke Jambi, dan di Jambi saya menemukan banyak hal yang terkait dengan apa yang diterangkan oleh Pak Manguin tadi. Ada beberapa situs-situs Sriwijaya yang saya kunjungi di sana. Yang terakhir kemudian kita menemukan ada orang yang menemukan. Jadi kita menemukan ada orang menemukan guling perahu yang besar sekali, yang panjang sekali. Nah, itu menjelaskan bagaimana kapal-kapal yang datang ke Sriwijaya di dekat Jambi itu berdatangan. Nah, menjadi persoalan kemudian adalah bagaimana state city kemudian berkembang menjadi sebuah hal yang lebih besar lagi ketika di Jambi, ketika dia menjadi city state. Dia kurang mengontrol, Sriwijaya tidak terlalu mengontrol, tetapi mengontrol secara politik teritorialitasnya. Dan yang menarik dari sini kemudian adalah bagaimana menjelaskan kepada publik lahirnya sebuah nasionalisme atau nasionalisme dari pernyataan-pernyataan yang didasari oleh temuan-temuan atau fakta-fakta histori dan fakta-fakta arkeologi. Akhirnya saya ingin mengatakan bahwa memang Pak Manguin sangat hebat menginspirasi di dalam pemberian warna arkeologi sejarah dan apapun itu untuk bangsa-bangsa, untuk membangkitkan nasionalisme atau menetapkan nasionalisme di Asia Tenggara. Terima kasih Pak Manguin, terima kasih untuk semuanya. Saya merasa sangat terhormat, merasa sangat tersanjung bisa mengawali diskusi. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Iwan atas. Saya sendiri berterima kasih Pak Iwan, Pak Irfai diberi kesempatan untuk bicara tidak sampai di Indonesia, tapi dari jauh, paling sedikit dari jauh ketemu lagi dengan teman-teman dari Indonesia. Saya rindu sekali datang ke Indonesia lebih sering. Mudah-mudahan tahun ini mulai lagi. Tapi saya juga mulai agak tua, nggak bisa seaktif seperti dulu. Ya, terima kasih.
Oke. Baik, telah sampailah kita di ujung dari diskusi kita sore ini. Saya ucapkan terima kasih Bapak Manguin dan Bapak Iwan Sumantri atas waktunya di sore ini. Je voudrais vous remercier, Monsieur Manguin. Merci beaucoup d'avoir nous accompagné ici dans la discussion. C'était vraiment intéressant, nous inspirer pour comprendre l'histoire de nation en Indonésie, quoi, avant l'indépendance, même bien avant. Oke, Bapak Iwan juga terima kasih banyak atas waktunya. Bisa terbayang di Makassar sudah selisih waktu 1 jam dari sini. Ya, waktu Indonesia Tengah. Ya, terima kasih semuanya, rekan-rekan semuanya, para peserta dalam diskusi sore hari ini. Akhir kata, selamat sore, selamat malam, dan mungkin selamat pagi menjelang siang.
Ya,
untuk
menjelang
Bapak
siang.
Manguin di Paris.
Belum makan siang.
Iya. Ya, sampai jumpa di kesempatan selanjutnya. Au revoir, Monsieur Manguin.
Au revoir.
Yeah.
Merci.
Yeah. See you next time for the next discussion, everyone.
Yes.